mysterious. Thanks for coming back, everybody, to Cryptid Mysterious. I do appreciate y'all. I got a pretty cool story. Actually, I got 2 Bigfoot encounters for y'all today. This first one is from somebody that is kind of scared of losing his credibility by what he does for a living, so he's going to remain anonymous. Well, I don't need to make up a fake name. I just won't say his name. Let's jump right into today's story. Oh, before we do that, what do y'all think of the new video footage I put in the background? I'm kind of getting tired of recycling the same old drone video that I have. I've always used my own footage in my own videos, but, until I get some more footage, I figured I'd get some of that generic B-roll. It's kind of cool. I mean, I know this channel isn't about the video, it's about the story. I just figured I'd mix it up a little bit. Well, let's get into today's Bigfoot encounters. First one begins. Myself, a guide, and my assistant had worked our way out close to Brook Falls, located in southwest Alaska, in the Katmai National Park. Not sure I'm saying that right. Is it Katmai? Katmai? Katmia. Well, anyway, my 2 companions were both armed, as entering this area during the salmon run was an extremely dicey and dangerous affair. We'd achieved a position some 75 yards from the western side of the river, from which, using my binoculars, we had watched as no less than 8 grizzlies set up both below and above the falls. On the opposite bank of the river, there are several areas which are well worn coming down to the river, which are the pathways of the bears that they've used for years to enter the river and eat. Although people do risk coming here to photograph the bears, on this particular day, there was not a soul around. It's amazing how persistent the bears are in their attempts to catch a fish. They must miss 50 in order to catch one. I was working, taking in the scenery, while my companions were on high alert, listening and looking over the surrounding area for any incoming bears. We'd come in at around 10 a.m., by which time we had hoped all the bears that were coming were already in the river. It was about 12 o'clock on the button when in 2 separate areas of the opposing bank, trees started shaking violently. I could actually hear them from my position, which was far from the river. As soon as this tree shaking had started, each of the 8 bears had turned their heads, looking in the direction of the sound. First one, and then all the bears began to exit the water, apparently spooked by the trees. Unfortunately for us, their exit was in our direction. The guide immediately said that we should retreat for our own safety. But I couldn't go. I had to stay, if just for a few more minutes, in hopes of seeing why they were scattered. The question being, what could spook 8 grizzlies from feeding? Just moments later, emerging from one of the very same paths which the bears had used to access the falls, came walking out not 1, but 2 enormous Sasquatch creatures. Amazingly, the Sasquatch did not enter the river to fish the falls, as the bears had done. They actually entered the shallow edges, with one walking in one direction, the other walking in another direction, combing the banks for the carcasses of the fish. I could see them swatting around in the grass, apparently searching for the remains of salmon. I had confirmed my assumption when one of them picked up a carcass and began to consume it. When the grizzlies had consumed a fish, 30% of the meat or better and the head were still on the skeleton. They would chomp the main body of the salmon and then drop it, and turn back into the river for another. The Sasquatch obviously knew this to be their behavior and allowed the bears to do the work for them, feasting on the remains when they were through. The tree shaking obviously known by the bear as an indicator that the Sasquatch were coming. From what we had just seen, the bears didn't want anything to do with them. Think what you will of them, but this singular demonstration by the bears had indicated just who was the king of the forest. Unfortunately, we could only watch them for a couple of minutes, now knowing that there were at least 8 grizzlies in the brush on our side of the river. Both of the Sasquatch were massive, with one being about 2 feet taller than the other. Believe it or not, the smaller one was somewhat blonde in color, while the larger one was more of an auburn. It was also interesting to see that they had chosen scavenging for the fish rather than getting in the river and attempting to catch the salmon leaping by the falls, as did the bears. The larger could have at least been 12 feet tall, and the smaller one probably in the neighborhood of 10 feet. Both were thickly muscled, and their faces were both furrowed with wrinkles, with their noses being broad and flat. Both of their skulls came to somewhat of a rounded point, with the hair on the heads being quite shaggy as it hung from the sides. The 2 largest bears in the group of grizzlies had to have weighed at least 1,200 pounds, yet the smaller of the 2 Sasquatch appeared larger than they did in its dimensions. It was an astonishing sighting, and something that we will never forget. You know, when I hear these stories and I hear people talk about how they want to stick around and see these things and they're not talking about how terrified they were, it makes it a little harder for me to believe the story, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm discounting the story. It's just hard for me to personally believe, because if I was in that situation, I would not be sticking around to try to get a closer look at one of these things. That's just me, especially when you're out in the woods like these guys. Can you imagine creatures that size scaring off a whole group of grizzly bears in Alaska? You want to stick around and find out? But then again, I guess I wasn't there. You never know. It would be a sight to see, that's for sure. Well, let's jump into our second encounter of the day. This one comes to us from Jerry, out of Montana. His sighting took place in 1992, and here is his story. We had been hiking for several days, following the snake, as we call it, when we found ourselves situated on an embankment, perhaps several hundred feet in height. Looking over the snake and the Tetons in the distance. From our position atop this hillside, we had a panoramic view of the opposing bank of the river, which extended as far as the eye could see in virtually every direction. Specifically, the bank that was directly opposite to us had very little, if any, tree cover. The cover that was visible grew gradually denser the further from the river it was. Several members of our group, almost at the same moment in time, began to point out several dark-colored animals moving through the trees on the other side. From our perspective, without the aid of any devices, these animals appeared to be as small black specks in the distance. But that would soon change. Each of the members of our group had their own pair of binoculars, which we now had taken out. As we all had our binoculars fixed on what previously had been 3 dark specks walking along in the trees, the consensus was resounding. What we were seeing was 3 Bigfoot walking along the snake. One of them being quite a bit larger than the other 2, and all of them walking in a single file line, which we found interesting. From this distance, even with the aid of our binoculars, there was virtually no detail to be seen, other than recognizing their unusual gait and arm swing. Their arm swing in a very robotic fashion, as though their 2 stiff appendages hanging from their sides, which are hinged to their shoulder. The 3 of them were all walking in what appeared to be a forward tilt, which is most certainly different than that of a human being. Their steps were uniform and very deliberate, showing no variation the entire time that we were watching. We got to watch these things meander around for about a half an hour before they were out of view in the trees. About 10 minutes later, they reappeared in a clearing further up the river, but by this time they were at least a mile away from our position. Once again, they appeared as specks, even with the aid of our binoculars. As you would imagine, there was quite a conversation going on between us as to what we were collectively seeing. Many in the group didn't believe they existed. Speaking for myself, I believed, but with certain reservations. This day had changed all of that for everyone. We knew exactly what we were looking at. There's no mistaking it. We don't have gorillas around here. They didn't even really look like gorillas. They most definitely were not bears. And they could not possibly have been human beings. There's just no way. They couldn't possibly have been 3 hikers wearing black. They had fur covering them that was visible from head to toe, and they were carrying no supplies, and they were wearing no footwear, all these things being a recipe for death in this area for a human. And yet, there they were before our own eyes. Well, fam, it may not have been a close encounter, but it was an encounter nonetheless. Honestly, that's the kind of encounter I'd personally like to have. Maybe I'm going to have to set up a trip to the Tetons. I've heard a fair amount of stories out of there. I know these things are everywhere, but from the Tetons, they always seem to be seen from a distance. I got to get out there and fly that drone around, see what I can come up with. Because if I'm out there taking pictures, you sure as heck know I'm going to be hitting that button. Get me some blob squatch pictures, as they call it. Well, appreciate y'all hanging out. If you got a Bigfoot encounter or anything mysterious that you'd like to share, I'd love hearing about it. Shoot me an email at cryptidmysterious@gmail.com, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Appreciate y'all.